Hello, AP World students. Today we're going to talk about the late modern age and how humans related to nature and how humans relate to energy. I get really excited about this particular time period just because it's so relevant to the issues that we're dealing with today. And so I do want to get into this and talk about, are humans in control of nature, or has this been an illusion for us? And I think that's the debate that we're kind of wondering about today is whether or not our control of nature as of recently has been one that really has provided for the best things for human beings. And there's good evidence on both sides to suggest that this could be overall positive, or there could be some big negatives that we're about to face. So we'll see what you guys think after the presentation. So first off, we have to talk about the 20th century context that really has changed things when we get to the late modern period. In the early modern period, we saw how coal and electricity had really driven new forms of progress, and that's the way the 20th century opens up. When the 20th century opens up, progress was being based upon science and innovation, new technologies were driven by coal, electricity, and then by the time we got into the 1940s, even nuclear energy started to arise as this incredible time for human beings to really be able to control nature and change it in a way that would lead to better living standards for human beings. And in fact, we saw that. In the last century, absolute living standards have risen around the world. In fact, since 1945, the number of people living on $2 a day, think of that just for a moment, $2 a day around the world has dramatically fallen. In fact, it's been halved throughout the world. So there is good evidence that we actually have seen absolute living standards really gotten better. And why is that the case? Well, actually there's a reason for this. Populations have moved from farming areas into urban and suburban centers. And whenever you do that, people's living standards get better. Why is that the case? Well, in farms, you have limited land. You have limited ability to produce things. But in factories, you have the ability to produce massive or mass production amounts of things. And so that really improves people's lives overall. In fact, a good example of this is something called the Green Revolution. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the amount of people in the population was growing dramatically. You probably remember from last week we talked about Thomas Malthus and this idea that population would eventually outstrip that of food, that we would see a geometrical growth of population in relationship to food. Well, a man came along to solve that problem. His name was Norman Borlaug. And Borlaug saw the possibility that Malthus could be correct, that in many parts of the world we might see population outgrow that of food. So he developed a scientific way to solve this problem. It was genetically modified foods. So these modifications allowed for new types of crops, what are called resistant crops. He would inject genetics from a variety of different sources into crops to make them more resilient, and it worked. In fact, Borlaug was able to mass produce food, and he's been credited today for saving millions of people. The problem is, it's as with most reforms, it's not a perfect system. In order to have that mass production of food, you really had to have increased amounts of irrigation, and then you also needed to use pesticides in order to grow that food. And that led to new forms of pollution. It led to new forms of problems for human health. And that led into the preservationist, and environmentalist movement. So Norman Borlaug solved a major problem, but he also gave rise to a new problem. So conservationists arose before the time period of Norman Borlaug. They arose in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and their argument was we've got to conserve natural resources, things like timber, mining materials, or fish. We've got to make sure that if you use something, you replace it or you recycle it so that we can have it for the future. Another group of people, though, arose under a man named John Muir. And they were called the Preservationists. They argued, nature has its own inherent value. You really should not be exploiting it. Now, in the long run, environmentalists are going to come out of the latter. They're going to come out of the preservationist mindset. And they're really going to argue that there's something that relates us to nature that we've lost. And it's a notion of what they call ecological relationships. That we might think that we're above nature and we can control it through our use of coal and steam and electricity. But in the end, our relationship to nature is pretty interdependent. And you can't really get outside of that. In fact, a woman who is going to really make that argument is a woman named Rachel Carson. She wrote a book called Silent Spring in 1962. In this book, she investigated the destruction here in California of eaglet eggs. She noticed that they just were not hatching. And she claimed the reason why was due to a pesticide called DDT. And the argument was this: DDT was not used on eaglet eggs. It was not used on eagles. It was used to maintain crops here in California. But what ends up happening is that when bugs come along and eat the crops, they get some of this pesticide into them. Birds like eagles come and eat the bugs, and they then get some of the residue of that pesticide into their system. And as that moves up the food chain, the problem that's going to happen is each predator is going to take in a certain amount of this pesticide. And eventually, she claimed, this causes cancer rates to be transferred along the lines of relationships. So her argument is, We're not outside of nature. We're a part of nature, even if we don't see it directly, or what's called an ecological relationship. So ecology is that natural relationship that draws us all in and makes us interconnected. And the significance of that is it means that human beings are within the natural relationships. We're not separate or unique from them. And the conclusion of that environmentalists drew is that we've got to find a way to live with nature. We've got to be more sustainable with nature. So they developed a critique on industrialism itself. Environmentalists began critiquing this whole notion that we could manipulate nature, that we could control it. Their critique saw an attack on the inherent value of nature and its negative effects. In other words, the point being that the Industrial Revolution just saw nature as a tool and we can use it for whatever, regardless. And the point here was not just that nature is beautiful, but that if we attempt to control nature, eventually that's going to kick back against us. And we'll talk in a few minutes about the biggest one of these, which is the influence of CO2 on trapping heat, or carbon dioxide and trapping heat in the atmosphere, creating what's called global warming or global climate change. Now, some environmentalists were pretty radical. They actually went even farther than this. Not all, but some. And they criticized monotheism, Christianity, Catholicism, Islam, Judaism itself. And they said, if you go back to the beginnings of the Bible, what does the Bible say? Well, it gives this image from God that we as human beings stand above nature, we control it, we name it, and then we control it. Many of the environmentalists pointed out, saying our biggest mistake we made was when we left a hunter-gatherer model. Instead, we need to go back to this notion, not that we become hunter-gatherers, but we need to go back to seeing the world the way the hunter-gatherers did. The earth is sort of our mother figure that we have to take care of. Most environmentalists don't go in that direction. That's more of the radical direction. Most environmentalists are going to call for something called sustainability. What they call for is alternatives within the industrial system. For example, one alternative is something called a carbon tax. Okay, the idea being that you would create a market in which you would say, look, we're gonna tax carbon, okay, and over time that will be gotten rid of. A second alternative is to create a carbon trading system in which we create a market in which people who want to use carbon can only use so much, and they're going to actually trade their carbon use on the market. Okay, and over time, the hope is by trading that, they can make money and start to invest in alternative energies like solar, wind, and nuclear that tend to be a little bit more in line with nature and not manipulating nature quite so much. Now, another big problem is going to be the problem that starts to develop in the 20th century between two countries, developing world countries and developed world countries. So a developed world country is a country that uses markets and the industry to develop itself economically. They have increased suburbanization, higher living standards, higher life expectancy. The developed world, which tends to be in the southern hemisphere, tends to have a lot of problems economically. For them, they're trying to industrialize. They tend to have pretty authoritarian governments. They tend to have most of their population living in farming areas, not urban areas. And generally speaking, for a long time, the argument has been if the developed world could just follow the model of places like America and Northern Europe, they would eventually become successful. So our big debate comes back to this about industrialization. Is it a good thing? So for some it is, because it has been really positive. It's led to new technologies, medicines, rising living standards. For others, it's an inherent problem because of its polluting effect. Also, the issue that's raised is between the developing and the developed world, that inequality that exists. And what's going to happen if the developed world industrializes? Is that a good thing for us? In fact, one of the biggest questions is global climate change itself. Think of for a moment if China and India, which are sort of developing countries, if all of a sudden they get to the point that we are at as a developed country with their large populations. Since 1850, we have seen pretty much just a slight change in Celsius temperature. We've gone from about 1.5% Celsius up to about like 1.8% Celsius. But all we need to have is a 1 to 2% change for dramatic negative impacts. And right now, it's not so much the amount that's changed, it's the rate that it's changing. The rate of temperature that has changed in the last century is the fastest on record that we have. Are there any other signs that global climate change is taking place? Well, yeah. One of the signs is the melting of the Arctic. Since the 1970s, the Arctic has lost 40% of its ice growth. Not its total ice, but its ice growth has dropped off by 40%. We've seen an increased cloud cover. Well, why does that matter? Well, because that means that we have more heat, and that's leading to more evaporation. We've also seen an increased spread of heat pathogens, heat-borne diseases around the world. These are all suggestions that we are seeing a massive global climate change that is taking place. So, what are our takeaways from the 20th century, the late modern period? The move from the old biological regime to fossil fuels provided for industrialization. And the truth is that that did improve living standards. I mean, across the board, there's tons of evidence to suggest that humans across the globe have seen a better life, whether it's what we talked about, decreased poverty, whether it's increased food, whether it's decreased people dying from a lack of food. All these things are really positive things. But the rise of a new type of principle called ecology, or the relationship of all organisms, arose to challenge this notion that humans really control nature. And actually, it's very possible that we've been living under an illusion. And global climate change suggests this could be the case. That actually, in order to create this control of nature, we may be undermining ourselves in the long term. And that's something we're going to have to figure out as we study in future units what we're doing in the globe. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in class.